the real category creators do things that look insanely stupid and difficult to the generic herd heuristic. With the example of the service company, we see this every day. And that's actually what makes it so fun being a specialist in this sector, because you can violate all these, hidden rules and or unwritten rules, not because you violate them, but because, hey, actually violating them is what allows me to think what a category creator would look like.
Yeah. Some investors, those who we don't partner with, I don't want to cast a very wide lens and wide aperture here. I think they're just very lazy at their approach, right? And where lazy compounds and it gets really damaging is to the startups that they're investing in. And they get lazy of, I'm going to apply this logic from this other industry and I'm going to now just slap it onto construction and I'm just going to jam it down your throat. That becomes, to Patrick's point, that becomes very detrimental. Ultimately, it's going to burn a lot of cash because I'm getting forced to move in this direction that's ultimately against the grain of like what the industry is like should be pulling in.
I think the biggest one that we cannot preach enough. Until my day of death, I will probably have to ram it into people's heads to get it, is that AECS is an outcome industry. And that's why it purchases services. It's a project industry, and that's why it purchases services. So starting as a business that builds software can be the right approach, but it's not automatically the right approach.
Okay guys, so episode 3, fallacies, with Adam and Patrick this time. So in this episode, we're going to discuss some common fallacies and herd heuristics, why the world doesn't need another generic VC firm, some flawed incentives and false patterns that lead VCs astray, some case studies of AECS startups that have defied conventional wisdoms, some lessons learned from Fundamental's mistakes, and the VC industry and Fundamental's approach. So kick us off, Martin.
Yes, hi guys. So in your recent letter, you stated something like construction tech world doesn't need any more generic VCs. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, the issue of venture and of founders is not having access to capital. We all talk very often about the recess in capital after 2021. And we actually think that was very healthy, but it did not lead to a lack of access to capital. In fact, there is more capital available today than at almost any point in time before 2021.
In construction or in general?
Everywhere, including construction, but all sectors. So having access to capital is not a founder problem, neither for the early stages nor for the late stages, which means the world doesn't need any more generic VC firms in order to distribute and allocate more capital. There's enough capital available, there's enough venture firms available. The channels have been established for many years between venture investors and founders. So any of that is not really required to add one more firm, one more generic firm to it. But if you now think about where the next 100 legendary firms will be built, our conviction is it will always be in these hard to disrupt and hard to transform sectors, of which we think we cover one of the most exciting ones, AECS, architecture, engineering, construction, and supply chains. But, and that's why generic VC firms are not necessarily required to add to the market anymore, these markets require nuance. They require dedicated empathy in order to really identify what those legendary firms could be in the very infant and early stages. And that's why we say, hey, another generic firm that doesn't dedicate to build that level of empathy, that level of, nuance is not really required.
Is it just simple lack of competence for general VCs to be successful within a construction tech, or?
I wouldn't say competence. I would say it's a lack of routine and practice, right? So dedicating to a craft is, it doesn't mean that you come with excellence. It means that you build excellence through routine, through practice, through looking under the same million rocks in construction. So in the end, you might lack the competence, but it's not generic competence that you're lacking. It's the experience, the expertise, the nuanced insight that you can only gain through repetition.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you really kind of look at some of the funds that are the most pronounced and most visible, what are they really accelerated in investing in and been successful in and around areas that have been investing for the past 30 years. So look at software as a service, enterprise SaaS, as well as cybersecurity. They've invested into these verticals for 30 years. They've grown a pronounced competencies of like what to look for, what not to look for, and actually over time that's refined and perfected. Their go-to-market strategy and deploying the capital. It's not an overnight success, as we always say. It's overnight success is 10 years in the making, and that could be 10 or 20 years. That certainly can be applied to funds as well, and how they deploy to specific verticals and sectors.
What about specialist VCs? So obviously generic VCs, you say the world doesn't need another. How about another one, for example, entering the AECS space?
I think that's a very good signal for the space if that's what's happening, right? So it shows that there's appetite in building a firm that dedicates to a space. I think someone that right now builds such a company probably comes to the conviction that we came to 5, 6, 7 years ago, is that this is as a space ripe for building another 100 or more legendary companies and generational companies. Whether the timing is good, I will leave to everyone else. Whether you can differentiate, that will be up to your execution. Yep. But I would take it as a very strong confirmatory signal that people love this market.
Yep.
Do VCs have? What are the VCs and patterns that drive VCs like thesis and investment thesis in like a general world of investing and maybe with specific vertically focused like construction tech?
So there is a framework that we use in Foundamental. So let me walk you through it, and we can put it up on the production screen, right? So what we have figured out is that if you think of the world as a 2x2 matrix, on the one hand side, you ask yourself, hey, what is hidden and what is obvious to the experts of construction and to the early customers? And on the other axis, you have what is hidden and what is obvious to generic people, generic investors, any other person that doesn't know anything about construction. You create a 4x4, a 2x2 with 4 quadrants, right? And the things that are obvious to everyone, the bottom right corner in my framework, right? That's companies that are either very late in their journey and are obvious successes now. Inframarket in our portfolio would be such a thing. So if you were now to clone Inframarket into a different category, well, it's obvious to everyone. It's obvious to the construction people, and it's obvious to the generic people. So what you're creating is a lot of competition. So you're basically category cloning. That can still lead you to success if you make local market adaptations based on the model. That could they could be hidden, but it is a quadrant to be careful about. In the top left corner, you would have things that are hidden to everyone. So you would be a founder, if you dedicated yourself to that would just say, hey, I'm taking insane market risk. Right now, the market conditions wouldn't allow me to succeed with the model I'm building. That's why it's hidden to everyone, right? But I'm comfortable betting that perhaps in 5 years, there's different market conditions. Regulation could be such a thing. That's a quite poor sector to invest in as a VC, because VCs hate uncontrollable factors. And that's really a crazy, crazy market bet that you are taking, but it could pay off big time, right? So these are 2 quadrants that can work, cannot work. Usually the chance to work is relatively low.
Are you invested in any of those?
Probably, but I would have to go through the portfolio, right? So it's not like we use the framework at every investment, and sometimes you only discover over time as well, right? But it's a great mental framework to ask yourself, and we ask ourselves that every time. Now in the bottom right, that's where you want to stay away, right? So this is basically what is obvious to the generic people, but hidden to the customers. That's just called a mirage. That just means, hey, I think I have something, but I haven't talked to the customers and they think it's nothing, right? So that's a mirage. And unfortunately, you will see a lot of startups being backed by generic investors into construction tech exactly in that quadrant, right? Now, the Goldilocks quadrant is the top right. So that's the stuff that is hidden to generic people and that is obvious to early customers and to experts. That's where you want to be, because that's where, as a specialist investor like Foundamental, we dedicate our life to, right? Is we want to see things earlier than generic investors. And because of our dedication to our craft, the routine, the repetition, the practice, the million rocks that we look under, we hope that we can see something earlier that is hidden to generic people. And as early stage investors, that's what our investment is about. So that's the Goldilocks quadrant where you want to be. And so now coming to the patterns, I think patterns is one thing, but signals is the other. So we look for signals that are obvious to us, to early customers, to other experts, but signals that are hidden to the generic people.
Common fallacies and herd heuristics. So what are some of the most common fallacies and herd heuristics you see in by generic VCs in the AECS space? And just maybe before that, could you just define the term herd heuristics?
So, I mean, a herd heuristic is when...
You can use the fly
Analogy.
comparison.
So I was saying before we recorded, right? So I was saying, hey, I mean, herd heuristics is when you see a pile of cow shit and there's a million flies on top of it, and your logic is, hey, I mean, cow shit must be great because a million flies cannot be wrong, right?
Yeah.
That's something that...
That's funny.
That's sort of the Wikipedia entry metaphor for herd heuristic, but that's what it is, right? So you think you have a heuristic that works, but the problem with herd heuristics in venture, not just AECS, but particularly also in our sector, is that we're in the business of chasing unique generational companies. And that makes the first principle a unique generational company. It does not repeat. So when I now apply heuristics of what does this unique company look like, can I find a clone of that? By definition, you're violating your purpose as an investor. And so now that's what herd heuristics unfortunately do, and that's how the human brain is wired and conditioned is. We're looking for the same patterns to reapply in order to make decision-making easy, but it shouldn't be easy. It should be unique, right? And so that's where herd heuristics unfortunately lead an investor to do exactly the wrong thing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Charlie Munger, I think there's a really pronounced, quote that he has, herd mentality, or you can say your heuristics is a regression to the mean, right? It's if you're following, the herd, it's essentially going to be, working against you in the long term, especially if you're trying to find these white truffles within their respective, vertical. You're trying to look for power law investments, and that's not going to be, courted by, every fund that's deploying capital. So you want to train you want to train those behaviors to get away from that. You kind of want to pirouette around that natural inclination, like, oh, all these other funds are kind of investing in this space or investing within this mandate, and you're like, oh, you must be smart. It's almost like intelligent idiots. It's like, hey, these guys are investing, so I want to kind of follow to them.
Yeah.
Let's do it, and you fall victim to that trap. And then what happens is you just have, if you look at the bell curve, like the regression of the mean, you're not going to have really great returns. And so I think that's ultimately the outcomes.
And Martin, we are seeing herd heuristics. I couldn't tell you how often a day. Like it must be happening 5-10 times a day, where we're seeing peers of ours, generic peers of ours, falling into that trap. Not because they're dumb, but because for them it's very, very hard to see the signals that are hidden in an early company in AECS because it has so much nuance. An example of that. So imagine you're a 20-year-old, 30-year-old generic VC firm, and you have built a lot of investment successes with software as a service companies. What are you going to look for in AECS? You're going to look for software as a service companies. Yeah. One of our best investments is a company that initially was a service as a service company, was net profitable, had terrific cash flows, had SaaS gross margins, 75% gross margins on the service. No generic VC touched the firm at the pre-seed round. Do
you know why?
Exactly what I'm saying, right? So because the herd heuristics told them this cannot be something, because it's not SaaS, it's service as a service, and I'm not touching service companies. You looked at the P&L and you were like, hey, this is just a terrific business. 1.2 million revenue run rate at the pre-seed, net profitable, 75% gross margins, insane customer love. Yeah. We looked at it and we said, this fits exactly what the sector needs. Right. It's exactly the core reasons of AECS to purchase companies is to deliver outcomes. This company was delivering the outcome, and it was rewarded with terrific customer love, cash flows, margins, etc. What are they now? They're now a software company 3 years later, because that's the journey that they took. But if your herd heuristics are, I'm looking for SaaS companies, you will miss out on these companies very early. Now the company is obvious, and it has raised from the best US investors a Series B, because now the company is obvious.
Yeah. It's almost like flipping on its head now. It's like, when the herd heuristics or herd mentality With a very named brand was looking into this company or investing within this style, it's like, you kind of get dragged in there. It's almost the inverse now. It's like if I see like, a big pool of a lot of these generalist VCs kind of investing in a very earliest point in its company's life cycle, I almost kind of shy away from it because, they're going to be applying like a broken mentality. And ultimately, I think it's going to have a negative impact on the company that they're investing. And to double click on what Patrick was saying is, to really detach and kind of distance away from that heuristic deployment, you have to have dedication and conviction into the vertical that you're investing in. And I think that kind of underpins what we were talking about earlier is having empathy. So it's almost like you want to have those contrarian bets against the herd because that's where you get the power law, outcomes. And I think that really starts from having conviction into our internal thesis and backing and leaning into that conviction.
Are you guys saying that generic VCs can't taste success in AECS?
They absolutely can. They absolutely can.
At early stage or later stage?
Exactly the point, Martin, right? So once a company is obvious, back to the framework, right? And obvious by the numbers, by the customer love, by customer case studies. When all of these things become obvious outside of the family of the shareholders to the wider world, you can make the right choices in AECS, right? And so that, in our experience, is typically after the Series A of a company. If you follow the traditional, it's been muddled and broken up a little bit, but like the traditional Series A understanding. So after that, companies that are successful and that follow a great model, that have the right product, the right channels, the right distribution, etc., they will become obvious. Before that, the real category creators do things that look insanely stupid and difficult to the generic herd heuristic. With the example of the service company, we see this every day. And that's actually what makes it so fun being a specialist in this sector, because you can violate all these, hidden rules and or unwritten rules, not because you violate them, but because hey, actually violating them is what allows me to think what a category creator would look like.
Yeah. I think one example is it was just kind of this repetitive violation of trying to apply this pricing model of like subscription SaaS to startups, serving and selling into the construction industry. I mean, if you really take a step back, like you're selling into, if you look at the P&L of a general contractor, it's like, the IT budget is wafer thin. So like, to see that, to really grab hook and really expand and grow into a unicorn or a $10 billion firm, it seems a very unlikely event. And we come to the conclusion of like, you should be essentially marketing or pricing your service as an outcome in some respects.
That is such an important point.
Right. And so like that was like a big like unlock that we saw. Like there was a lot of like downward advice that was spewed and breathed towards these startups. Like, well, you should just do a pricing model of subscription SaaS, and they didn't really have empathy or understanding of the customer they were selling into.
Exactly.
And it was just like a disconnect. Like the general contractor was like, I've never purchased a solution in this manner. They've always purchased in a different. I've always purchased the outcome.
And the world is full of first principles. So let me build on what you're saying, Adam, right? So the first principle in construction is, think of the profit and loss statement of a construction company and its cost structure, right? So the cost structure below the revenue, including the gross margin, it will differ a little bit by subsegment, whether you do infrastructure or residential. But on general, let's say 50% of the cost structure will be materials, 48% will be labor and machinery, and 2% will be IT.
Exactly.
So if you're now a generic investor, you're going into early stage in AECS, your recommendation, and that's a fallacy, to the startup is going to be exactly what you are saying. Hey, go for software. So you're addressing 2% instead of 98%. It's the most stupid thing that you can actually do in an industry that is project-based, service-based, knowledge-based, and completely comfortable paying for services to deliver outcomes.
Exactly.
So that's what you need to dedicate your life to in order to find this.
Yeah.
You put it in an interesting way. I would just call it incompetence, because if someone is not is trying to attack early stage and they don't know what they're doing, they only see the signals later, and at the later stage, they're just
well, so it wouldn't be like a competency. It was just, I also like, I think it's a failure to
recognize things.
To also force yourself to do first principle thinking. I think that's where a lot of generalists kind of fail as well. And so like, hey, what got them to be great is first principle thinking, and essentially where they've done really bad is kind of pirouetting around, shying away from what got them to be great, and applying some failed logic that. I'm going to juxtapose this business model to something that's new. Oh, it's supposed to stick because it has stuck before, and that's just not first principle thinking. From where I'm sitting,
you're actually trying to scale what is unscalable. So you found something that worked in one place, right. And now you think, hey, I've drunk the Kool-Aid. Now let me copy that principle into a different context, and that doesn't work. Again. The nature of our business is we need to chase generational companies, and generational companies do not repeat. They have their own ingredients every time.
Yep.
So connecting one of the previous episodes we did about the amount of funding that's going into construction or AEC tech. Let's say as a result of that, there'll be more generic VCs entering AECS by virtue of the numbers. So I'm guessing there'll be a lot more of these failed or fallacies and herd heuristics enter in the bank of fundamental, or fundamentals knowledge, should we say. Mm-hmm. Do you have any more examples of you mentioned profit and loss?
I think there's an interesting example around quick commerce. Let's talk about that. And in Adams, in your market in the US, we had a lot of, so quick commerce just by definition, real quick, everybody will know this, 2020, 2021, you had Gettier and Gorillas and Flink and 1,000 other category clones that raised within the span of oftentimes 9 months, billions, with a B, billions, in order to allow someone to order one piece of grocery within 10 minutes I still don't understand how anyone could make the margins work.
Yeah.
And I'm firmly convinced that people looked at this and thought, well, the margins don't work. Let's go for it.
Yeah.
Right? And so then this category that was unproven, the only thing that was, the only signal that I was referring earlier to signals, the only signal was the amount of fundraising. That was the only signal. Other than that, the business models were completely unproven.
Yeah.
And so now we had a lot of founders as well as investors backing the clone of that into construction. Yeah. And so in the US as well as in Europe, we then had companies that do quick commerce for power tools or quick commerce for nails. Mm-hmm. Same results.
Mm. Yeah, exactly. I mean, we had the benefit of seeing some of those companies. It's almost like the last mile. You can say last mile, like Lyft or Uber or Postmates. Doing that last mile. Hey, I need an emergency. Red Bull or whatever type of product you want to consume. And so the failed logic there was like, well, let's apply that same methodology and that business model to the built world. We looked extensively at a lot of those last mile firms. We ultimately made the bet that these were going to ultimately fail. Some were going to ultimately go belly up. I think, looking back in the rearview mirror, I think we were dead on. I think there was a lot that just, went to the sidelines. And so I think it's, again, having a repetitive refreshing of being first principle thinking and applying that to the knowledge that we've been harvesting over these many years of working, collaborating with these large stakeholders, multinational stakeholders that are in the space, as well as just the earned learnings that we've earned from backing these founders who have been successful. And these things are these compound over time. And I think sets us apart. If I'm gonna against a generalist, or I'll even put another sector-specific fund on the table as well.
And it works with this example of quick commerce for construction, right? So one of the things that we realized is that most of the venture investors have empathy for two things: being a consumer and being an IT manager. Why? Mm-hmm. Because if you look across the map of most venture investors in the world, they will have been before a consumer and an IT manager. IT manager in the sense that they either were at one of the large IT firms or they were a founder that sold to one of the large IT firms. So that's where they have empathy, which is why backing software as a service companies, selling to horizontal enterprises, they had good empathy for. Mm. Backing consumer type companies, whether you like the category or not, I don't, but they were good companies being built. they had good empathy for that, which allowed them an unfair insight to find these companies early and evaluate the business. But now when you apply that same thinking, hey, I'm a consumer, I love quick commerce, ergo, a construction manager on a construction site needs to love quick commerce too, that's a fallacy.
Yeah.
That doesn't work. In quick commerce, in construction, you have a 150 euro basket to make an emergency purchase once a month.
Yeah.
Those cohorts don't work. As a marketplace, it's just not giving you enough of a business to recover all the CAC. And by the way, the gross margin is not good too, right? But for that, you need to have then the specific empathy.
Yeah, I would say that a lot of those business models were the beneficiary of a very low interest rate, and so you kind of got by, and it was just funding to fund, and you're essentially like, gross margins were negative, and so the gravy train was always there, and those models were essentially propped up on air, essentially just capital just being flushed into the market. I think what to kind of steer and to change gears, like this market correction, I think is going to be a huge beneficiary for I think the industry at large, because there's not going to be a lot of waste. I think there's going to be a lot of first principle thinking, and that's going to be applied to capital deployments, to founders that really know the space, and actually improving productivity and efficiency into the the subsectors that they're attacking.
So on this, are negative gross margins a fallacy of this space? Because can you imagine startups in construction tech be having gross margins, or they do have or don't have? What's your thoughts?
I mean, so I always when posed this question about gross margins and negative gross margins, I kind of refrain from just. The old mentality was great growth for the sake of growth, and so like if you looked at Uber, the very pronounced example, hey, we're just going to grow for the sake of growth. It becomes toxic at the end of the day. They've launched in new markets just to grow, and what happened there? Like they launched in 2 different markets, one in India and one in China. What happens? They got hit in the face, and they found out what happened there. And so I think just for the whole venture mentality for just grow for the sake of growth. Just go for revenue expansion. Forget about margins. I think it was just you can maybe just get by in 0% interest rate, but today it's just not going to fly. It's just there's no way. So I think there's higher emphasis on better run firms with demonstrated business models that are successful with them.
I do have an example actually, an anecdote to share here, which exemplifies a lot of exactly that thinking and why we pass on that repeatedly. Negative gross margins, we never got it and we never will get it. So I was talking to the founder of a marketplace of a specific kind of building material in Europe. The founder is an ex-Uber person and worked in Uber.
Driver?
No, but also not an operator, right? So was not in the sense that he was launching a market or managing a market. He was actually, his role was disbursing driver subsidies. So disbursing driver subsidies, Uber in every market had billion-dollar pockets to make certain algorithmic decisions which parts of a region to give drivers more incentives to show up there. So he was part of a team that basically
spreading money.
Exactly. It was a cost center, right? Okay, so now this person founded this company, and what he said to me in his first pitch, pre-seed, I asked him about the gross margins, contribution margins, and how he's going to plan to become net profitable. It's a 100% true story. The real answer this person gave me was, I'm not going to be even gross margin positive. I'm going to have negative gross margins in order to subsidize growth and get as much as possible. My response to him was, you're not going to do business that way because your customers will actually say, hey, I don't think you will be around in a year from now. And that's exactly the reality of construction, right? So construction is where customers want to be able to rely on you, and they're exceptionally savvy people. They know exactly how business works. Even if someone doesn't have the most fancy university degree, they will know how business works. Right? And so what happened? I mean, I told him, you're just building a spot marketplace. You're just building an emergency marketplace. When someone is out of your material and they need it in 24 hours, that's when they're going to buy from you because they have nowhere else to go. That's exactly what happened.
Maybe we can touch on one more thing about this gross margins, and then we move on back to the fallacies, this is a fallacy actually. So So the question is there a point in time for a founder to switch from this negative gross margin mentality to become profitable at some point? And how do you look at this?
Another way to frame the question is like to see when gross margins shrink or grow. That's a healthy sign of a business. If you're growing, if you're leaning into say products, you should be seeing like increase or compression of margins depending on how the business is growing. But if it's a consistently downward trend, if I'm consistently negative margins, or if I'm consistently like worsening off my margin profile of my business, it's obviously not a good business to be running.
It's just a mirage.
Yeah, exactly.
It's nothing.
Exactly.
And you keep going by saying, well, at scale, I will be profitable.
Exactly. But there is knowledge to see when margins increase or decrease depending on how the company's leaning into growth. Are they expanding? Are they hiring? But there's some business models that are just will never be cash flow positive. They'll never be gross margin. Healthy gross margins, just because it's just not a business model that is deemed to be a successful one.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Can you, as Fundamental, leverage these fallacies? For example, when you deal with founders, if they see that you are vertically focused on the construction tech versus other VCs who approach them and they are generalists?
I think it happens relatively frequently. I can't say every day but relatively frequently, that any of the three of us and our colleagues have a founder telling us, finally, someone who understands my business. It happens so regularly. And it's not because we're smarter than the generic VC investor. The difference is the generic VC investor has to look at pharma, and then the next day at agriculture tech, then the next day at logistics tech, the next day at a consumer play, and then once a year, that person looks into construction. It's very hard to get it if I have to cover 50 different sectors.
That's right.
And I get to see perhaps 3-4 days a year something in construction tech, right? And so for the founders, the experience in the early years, when you're not obvious yet, and the signals are hidden, and a VC investor gives you, half an hour, a couple hours to explain it, it's hard to get it right away, right? And so our experience is really regularly that founders tell us, finally someone who gets it. And getting doesn't necessarily mean only, okay, I understand the market, that's part of it, but also why you have chosen the model you have chosen. Why the model that is contrarian looking to a generic software as a service investor is making sense here. For us, we find that very easy to understand in most cases.
Yep.
I'll add to this. So I've worked in construction for 12, 13 years, and I barely feel like I've scratched the surface of what goes on. And that's like day to day, full time.
Yep.
Who knows? Is there like for building on Martin's question a bit, for founders and startups building within, let's say, AEC or generally, is there like a want for them to be associated with a generic VC which has a big name versus someone like that's lesser known but more specialist?
I think there's this natural, I think it becomes like to a maturity aspect, I think, this is my own opinion, of you find like the very young, immature founders will ultimately gravitate towards what glitters, and just the name brand. If that name brand is a success, then I'm deemed successful. What they usually find out is that it's not value accretive when you have these big funds at the most earliest days, because what you really want to have is at the earliest point in a founder's journey, it's like the job of the venture fund is to, how do you collapse these very expensive earned learnings to very inexpensive ones? How do you coach? How do you signal to watch out for this this speed bump? Look around this corner if they haven't been there before. If not, you're just going to be a armchair investor, and that's not going to be beneficiary to the startup industry.
In fact, I have a company which is a software as a service company targeting SMBs, small, medium-sized businesses, contractors in construction. And I'm sharing the board with a generic SaaS investor. Here, the advice that person has given that company for a year has even been detrimental. It has been the wrong advice. And the problem is, so this company they just did their Series A. So now is the time when they should become obvious in the next year or two to most investors. And this other SaaS investor, because he's following heard heuristics of what worked, basically the advice was just open the valve for marketing. Just increase the marketing spend and things are gonna happen. What we told that firm is it will not work, and we analyzed the entire SaaS benchmarks and we said, here's where you see why it won't work. Instead, you need to go offline. You need to go after the local associations, right? The craftsman associations. You need to go to local events, have a booth there, walk around. You need to build other referral mechanisms from customer to customer, contractor to contractor. This firm was completely confused by the advice that the other person gave them because, of course, like, hey, this other person has had success with turning up marketing in other generic industries. It did not work. You know what happened in the last board meeting? That person pretended like he has always said that they should go after offline. And I was biting into my table there, and I was like, hold on. Like, what movie am I in? I'm glad we're now there, right? But it actually, so to Adam's point, right? Not only did it not collapse the expensive earned learnings, it actually expanded expensive earned learnings.
Is it not built on the conviction that these investors got used to being in businesses, B2C businesses, and construction is not that B2C, sorry, it's more B2B. And the marketing, spending money on marketing is just on B2B activity or hoping that the customer, the end customer will see the product or service, which is pointless. You know?
Yeah. I would even say, like, in a more uncharitable way, I think, you know, it's some investors, those we don't partner with, you know, I don't want to cast a very wide lens and wide aperture here. I think they're just very lazy at their approach, right? And where lazy compounds and it gets really damaging is to the startups that they're investing in. They get lazy of, I'm going to apply this logic from this other industry and I'm going to now just slap it onto construction and I'm just going to jam it down your throat. It becomes, to Patrick's point, that becomes very detrimental. Ultimately, it's going to burn a lot of cash because, you know, I'm getting forced to move in this direction that's ultimately against the grain of like what the industry is like should be pulling in. And so, yeah, I'm just reminded of it's a constant practice of first principles. Align yourself with this other co-investors that have a greater appreciation, because again, it's not Foundamental, that can support and buoy the whole construction ecosystem. We need to partner with funds that are thinking the same way we do, that can support them in other capacities, and can maybe shying away from those who are constantly just regurgitating toxic advice.
and that's what the mature founders get. Yeah. The mature founders get like, hey, I'm choosing the person. Yes. I'm not choosing any history or brand.
Yes, exactly. And it's almost because it's almost like if a name brand. I guess we shouldn't be always like punishing or using these large generalists as a punching bag. But in some respects, if a name brand invests in your pre-seed, it's almost like a kiss of death. It almost like signals like, okay, that's going to be It is a kiss of death of that firm, because ultimately they probably won't follow on. And what happens to that firm? Like they give up too easily, because they're not trying to invest more time in an industry that they're only visiting twice a year.
Yeah.
So why want to put more effort in an industry that I don't really understand, and I'm only deploying 1% of my capital that I manage. So it becomes like, okay, I'm dislocation, and I'll just I won't follow on. I won't continue to support you because I need to. I need to dedicate more time and my resources to understand you.
And I just need to double underline, we've discussed this, but why that is the case. Again, it is the case because our industry, AECS, like some other B2B industry,